Over the past 2 decades, Congress has been bankrupting our nation. You go back to the year 2000, our national debt was $5 trillion. That sounds like a wildly different world than where we are today, because it was a wildly different world. Think about that for a moment. 42 presidents over the course of more than 2 centuries had built up a total debt of $5 trillion. Then a Republican came into office, George W. Bush. And over the next 8 years, under a Republican president, our national debt went from $5 trillion to $10 trillion. We doubled the national debt in just 8 years. Then a Democrat came into office, Barack Obama. And over the next 8 years, the national debt doubled yet again, going from $10 trillion to $20 trillion. Now pause and reflect on that. 42 presidents over 2 centuries built $5 trillion in debt. 2 presidents, 1 Republican and 1 Democrat, over just 16 years, quadrupled our national debt. And now over the last 6 years, again with a Republican president and a Democrat president, we've seen national debt grow from $20 trillion to $31.5 trillion. This is unsustainable. The American people at home, if you're fed up with inflation, if you're fed up with the cost of food skyrocketing, with the cost of electricity, of rent, of lumber, of mortgages, of gasoline, of cars, of everything you buy, it's because politicians in Washington cannot stop spending money that we don't have. Now, we are at a moment in time because the American people elected a Republican majority in the House where we have an opportunity to stop the madness. And I believe it is incumbent on that Republican majority and on Republicans in the Senate to use every lever point we have to stop the out-of-control spending that is driving inflation, that is punishing hardworking Americans across this country. As everyone here is writing, the debt ceiling is coming up. And the debt ceiling historically has proven the most effective lever point to force meaningful concessions. Now let me dispense with a canard. Nobody standing here wants to default on the debt. Let me be absolutely clear and unequivocal. The United States of America should never, ever, ever default on its debt. And whether or not the debt ceiling is raised immediately, the United States will not default on its debt. Why? Because revenue that comes in each month exceeds the interest payments that are owed. There is more than sufficient revenue coming in to ensure we never default on the debt. And every one of us supports legislation I call the Default Prevention Act, to put that in statute, to make clear the chances of a default are 0.00%. The reason the Default Prevention Act hasn't been passed is the Democrats block it. There is one principal person in this town that is talking about a default of the debt, and that is Joe Biden. Joe Biden wants to threaten a default in the debt. He wants to scare the markets. And frankly, he's counting on y'all. He's counting on the press corps just to repeat his talking points. He's counting on the press corps just to say, those crazy Republicans want to default on the debt. That is false. And if you write that in your stories, you are simply repeating partisan talking points from the White House. Historically, the debt ceiling has proven incredibly effective. In 2011, by standing strong on the debt ceiling, the Republican majority in the House forced passage of the Budget Control Act, the most significant constraint in federal spending in modern times. When I arrived here in 2013, Republican leadership was crowing about the great fiscal responsibility they saw because of the Budget Control Act. And then they turned around and abandoned it a couple years later. You go back before that, Graham Rudman, the most significant structural restraint on spending, passed because Congress held up the debt ceiling and used its leverage to force those reforms. And so I'm going to urge the members of the press, as this fight plays out, report it accurately. The rules of the Republican conference provide not that we will never raise the debt ceiling. It is not my position that we will never raise the debt ceiling. Rather, what the rules say is we will use the debt ceiling as leverage to force real and meaningful structural reforms to fix the underlying problem. It doesn't have to be a total solution for everything, but it has to be real and meaningful progress. And I will point out those rules that were written in the rules, I wrote them alongside the other senators who are standing up here today. That is the official position of the Republican conference. So we're going to see lots of fireworks. We're going to see lots of drama. We're going to see lots of Democrats. By the way, Joe Biden's position is facially unreasonable and ridiculous. Here's Joe Biden's position. I refuse to negotiate anything. That's what he's telling you. I don't care that there's a Republican majority. I don't care that we're bankrupting the country. I don't care that there's inflation ravaging this country. I, Joe Biden, will negotiate nothing. To hell with you. Let's default. That's Joe Biden's position. And on its face, it is objectively unreasonable. The reason he can take that objectively unreasonable position is because he believes the press will protect him. He believes that in your coverage, you won't talk about how it's objectively unreasonable for the president to say, I don't care what the Congress says. My answer is hell no. He's counting on you for that. That's unreasonable. It's irresponsible. And we're here to encourage the members of the House and the members of the Senate to hold the line and get serious about fixing this problem.